They say bedtime horror is harmless until the night something actually answers back. What you're about to hear might not let you sleep the same again. Quick warning, don't listen unless you're ready to question what's really in the dark before you drift off and forget. Like, subscribe and tell me, where you watching from and what time is it right now? It helps me bring the next story even closer. Have you ever been woken in the dead of night by a telephone ringing? That shrill, insistent sound cutting through the darkness, dragging you from sleep with its urgent demand for attention? It's disorienting, isn't it? That moment of confusion as you fumble for the receiver, your mind still clouded with dreams, wondering who could possibly be calling at such an hour. I used to have a landline telephone in my bedroom. Old-fashioned, I know, but there was something comforting about its solidity, its reliability. Mobile reception in my cottage was patchy at best, one of the drawbacks of living in a remote corner of the Yorkshire Dales. The stone walls of the 19th century building seemed determined to block any signal attempting to penetrate its boundaries. So I kept a landline, despite friends teasing me for my technological backwardness. I lived alone in that cottage, having moved there after my divorce 3 years prior. It was peaceful, isolated enough to provide the solitude I craved after the collapse of my marriage, yet not so remote as to be inconvenient. The nearest village, Thornwick, was just 2 miles away, a pleasant walk on fine days, a quick drive when the Yorkshire weather turned foul, as it often did. My cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane that eventually petered out into a sheep trail across the moors. No other dwellings were visible from my windows, just rolling hills, dry stone walls, and the occasional hardy tree bent permanently sideways from years of battling prevailing winds. At night, without the light pollution of cities, the darkness was profound, almost tangible. On clear nights, the stars were breathtaking in their multitude. On cloudy nights, like the one I'm about to describe, the darkness was absolute. It was mid-November, and the weather had turned unseasonably cold. Rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, drumming against the cottage windows, turning the lane into a flowing stream of muddy water, and keeping me mostly housebound. I didn't mind. I had my books, my writing, and enough supplies to last a week or more. There was something quite satisfying about being warm and dry while listening to the elements rage outside. That night, I went to bed around 11, as was my habit. I remember checking that the doors and windows were securely locked. A city dweller's precaution that I'd never quite abandoned, despite the negligible crime rate in the area. The wind had picked up, howling around the eaves, and occasionally gusting with such force that the whole cottage seemed to shudder. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows. I found the sound soothing, a perfect natural lullaby that soon carried me into deep sleep. I can't say exactly what time it was when the telephone rang. Late enough that the sound seemed to violate some unwritten law of nocturnal silence. Late enough that my first thought was a catastrophe. Someone had died. There had been an accident. Some emergency required my immediate attention. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, knocking over a glass of water in my haste. The light, when it came, seemed offensively bright after the perfect darkness. The telephone continued its shrill demand as I squinted at the alarm clock. 3:17 a.m. Nothing good ever comes from a call at 3:17 a.m. I lifted the receiver with a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. Hello. My voice was rough with sleep, uncertain. Silence. Or not quite silence. There was a quality to the quiet that suggested an open line, the faint electronic hiss of a connection. Hello. I repeated more firmly this time. Who is this? Still nothing. But now I could hear what might have been breathing. Soft, measured, deliberate. The breathing of someone trying not to be heard. It wanted me to know they were there. A prank call, I thought. Some teenagers from a village with nothing better to do than harass the reclusive writer who lived out on the moors. It wouldn't be the first time. Look, it's the middle of the night, and this isn't amusing. I'm hanging up now. I was about to do just that when the person on the other end finally spoke. Don't you recognize my voice, Sarah? The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they froze me to spot. Because yes, I did recognize the voice. It belonged to my mother who had died 14 years ago. The receiver grew slippery in my suddenly sweating palm. Who is this? I demanded. My own voice now a strangled whisper. This isn't funny. A soft chuckle came down the line. So familiar. So impossible. It's not meant to be funny. Darling, I need to speak with you. It's important. It was her voice. The same gentle cadence. The same slight Devon accent that all her years in London had never quite erased. A voice I'd never thought to hear again outside of old home videos. An increasingly unreliable theater of my own memories. This can't be happening, I said, as much to myself as to the caller. You're not real. Oh, Sarah. Another soft laugh. Tinged with the fond exasperation she'd often expressed when I was being particularly stubborn. Always so rational. So determined to categorize the world into neat little boxes of possible and impossible. You haven't changed at all. My mother is dead, I said flatly. She died of cancer in 2009. I was with her when she passed. So, whatever sick game this is. I know you were with me. The voice interrupted gently. You held my hand. You told me it was okay to let go. That you would be fine. That you would be brave. A chill that had nothing to do with the November night crawled up my spine. Those were the exact words I'd spoken as my mother took her final breaths. Words I'd never share with anyone, not even my ex-husband. They were private, sacred in their grief. How could you possibly know that? I whispered, because I was there, darling. It was me you were speaking to, just as it's me speaking to you now. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. A cruel prank by someone who somehow knew intimate details of my mother's death. A vivid dream from which I would soon awaken. A hallucination brought on by stress, isolation, grief. Anything but the impossible alternative that the voice on the phone was suggesting. What do you want? I managed to ask, surprised by the steadiness of my voice despite the trembling that had overtaken my body. There was a pause, filled only with that soft breathing. When she spoke again, her voice had changed subtly, an edge of urgency now threading through familiar tones. To warn you, Sarah, you need to leave the cottage. Tonight. Now. What? Why? Because you're not alone there. I glanced involuntarily at my bedroom door. Securely closed as always. Beyond it lay the darkened cottage. The small sitting room with its stone fireplace. The compact kitchen. The study where I spent most of my days writing. All empty. All secure behind locked doors and windows. Of course I'm alone, I said. There's no one else here. There is, she insisted, her voice dropping even lower. It came in with the rain. Through cracks you can't see, gaps you don't know exist, old buildings like yours, they're never as solid as they seem. A gust of wind rattled the windows, making me jump. The rain had intensified, hammering against the glass with renewed fury. Mum, I said, the childhood address slipping out unbidden, you're frightening me. Good, she replied bluntly. You should be frightened. Fear might keep you alive. Now listen to me very carefully. You need to leave immediately. Don't turn on any more lights. Don't stop to pack. Just put on your shoes, grab your car keys, and go. This is insane, I protested. It's the middle of the night. It's pouring rain. And you want to flee my perfectly secure home because of some vague warning from A. I couldn't bring myself to articulate what I was apparently accepting, that I was speaking to my dead mother. It's not a vague warning, she said sharply. It is very specific. There is something in your cottage, Sarah, something that has been watching you, waiting for the right moment. And that moment is coming very soon. As if to punctuate her words, a floorboard creaked somewhere in the cottage. The old building often settled and shifted, especially during weather changes. It meant nothing. And yet, what is it? I asked, my voice barely audible now. What's in here with me? For the first time, she hesitated. I can't. The rules are complicated. There are limits to what I can say, what I'm allowed to reveal. Just trust that I know, Sarah. I can see things from where I am that you can't possibly comprehend. Another creak, closer this time, just outside my bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat. Mum. I whispered, there's something outside my room. I know, she said, her voice now tight with suppressed urgency. You need to leave. Now. Is there a window in your bedroom? Yes, but it's small, and it's a 6-foot drop to the garden below. That doesn't matter. Better a sprained ankle than what awaits you if you stay. Go to the window, Sarah. Now. The doorknob to my bedroom began to turn, slowly, silently. I hadn't locked it. Why would I, living alone? I stared in horrified fascination as it rotated, degree by degree. Sarah, my mother's voice was sharp, commanding. The window. Now. I moved then, throwing back the duvet and lunging for the window on the far side of the room. It was an old casement window, painted shut over years of neglect before I bought the cottage. I'd meant to fix it, to make it operational, but it had never seemed urgent. Now I clawed at it desperately, breaking nails as I tried to force it open. The telephone lay abandoned on the bed, my mother's voice a tinny, distant sound calling my name. The doorknob completed its rotation. The door began to swing inward, moving with deliberate slowness that somehow heightened my terror. I redoubled my efforts on the window, sobbing now with fear and frustration. With a sudden crack of splintering paint, the window gave way, swinging outward into the rain-lashed night. Cold air and driving rain immediately rushed in, soaking my nightdress and chilling my skin. I didn't care. I had an escape route. I cast one glance back at the slowly opening door. The gap was still narrow, but in the dim light spilling from my bedside lamp, I could see something moving in the darkness beyond. Something that didn't seem to reflect light as it should. Something that shifted and flowed like liquid, but held a shape that was almost, but not quite, human. I didn't wait to see more. With a desperate strength born of pure terror, I hauled myself up onto the window ledge, heedless of the broken glass cutting into my palms. Outside was darkness, rain, and a long drop to uncertain ground. Behind me was something that even the dead feared. It wasn't a difficult choice. I jumped, tumbling through cold rain and colder darkness, bracing for impact. The ground came up faster than expected, knocking the breath from my lungs as I landed awkwardly on sodden grass. Pain shot through my right ankle, sprained or broken. I couldn't tell and didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and the cottage. I staggered to my feet, gasping at the pain but forcing myself to move. The rain was coming down in sheets, instantly soaking me to the skin. The darkness was nearly absolute, the night sky obscured by heavy clouds that blocked moon and stars alike. I could barely make out the garden path that led around to the front of the cottage where my car was parked. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the scene in stark white light. In that momentary flash, I looked back at my bedroom window, expecting to see it empty. It wasn't. Something was framed in the window, something tall and thin and wrong. Its proportions weren't human. Limbs too long, torso too narrow, head too small. But it was a face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. In that split second of illumination, I saw that it had my face. My features, perfectly copied, but arranged in an expression I'd never worn. A hunger so ancient and alien that it could never belong to anything that had once been human. Darkness returned in the wake of the lightning, but the afterimage remained burned into my vision. I ran, sobbing, stumbling on my injured ankle, following the garden path more by memory than sight. The gravel drive came under my bare feet, sharp stones cutting into my soles, adding fresh pain to the symphony of terror and confusion. My car sat where I'd left it, a darker shape against the night. I fumbled in the pocket of my night dress for the keys I'd instinctively grabbed before approaching the window. My mother's warning had penetrated at least that far. My hand shook so violently that it took 3 attempts to slot the key into the lock. But finally, the door opened. I threw myself inside, locking it immediately behind me. The familiar interior of my small hatchback offered an illusion of safety, quickly dispelled when another lightning flash revealed the cottage door standing open. A figure stood silhouetted against the light from within, the same elongated, wrong-proportioned shape I'd seen at the window. It was moving toward the car with a smooth, gliding motion that suggested it wasn't walking so much as flowing across the ground. My hands trembled as I tried to insert the key into the ignition. Once, twice, 3 times I missed, my vision blurred by rain and tears. The 4th attempt succeeded, and the engine roared to life. I didn't wait to see if the approaching figure would reach me. I threw the car into reverse, backing out of the drive, so quickly that the rear wheels skidded on the wet gravel. Then forward gear, accelerator pressed the floor, the small car fishtailing as it found purchase and shot down the narrow lane. In my rear view mirror, illuminated by my taillights, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the lane, not pursuing, merely watching as I fled. It raised one impossibly long arm in what might have been a wave or a gesture of promise. I'll see you again. I drove blindly through the night, the rain-slick roads treacherous under my tires. My only thought was to put distance between myself and whatever had invaded my home. I headed for Thornwick, for the lights and people and normality of even a small village. It wasn't until I reached the village square, the car heater finally taking the edge off my violent shivering, that I remembered the telephone, my mother's voice, the warning that had saved my life. Had it truly been her? Some remnant of maternal love reaching across the barrier between life and death to protect her daughter one final time? Or had it been something else? Another entity, perhaps less malevolent than what had come with the rain, but supernatural nonetheless? I found myself parked outside the Greyhound, Thornwick's only inn, despite the ungodly hour. A light still burned in the window, and when I staggered to the door, soaked and bleeding and half-mad with fear, the elderly landlord took one look at me and ushered me inside without question. That night, as I huddled under borrowed blankets beside a hastily rekindled fire, I told him what had happened, not the full story. I omitted the call from my dead mother, presenting it instead as a fortuitous impulse that had led me to check the cottage and discover an intruder. He nodded gravely and called the police, who arrived an hour later, by which time the rain had finally stopped and dawn was breaking over the damp countryside. They found nothing at the cottage, no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there besides myself. The bedroom window was closed and locked, showing no indication it had ever been wrenched open in desperate flight. The floorboards that creaked so ominously yielded nothing but the ordinary settling noises of an old building. Even the telephone, when checked, revealed no record of an incoming call at 3:17 a.m. or indeed at any time that night. The police were kind but skeptical. They suggested I'd had a vivid nightmare, perhaps triggered by the storm and the isolation of country living. One officer gently recommended I speak to my GP about possible night terrors or medication that might help with anxiety. I didn't argue. How could I explain the inexplicable? How could I make them understand what I'd seen in that lightning flash? The thing with my face that was not me. I never returned to the cottage. I arranged for a service to pack and ship my belongings to London, where I rented a small flat in a crowded neighborhood, surrounded by the comforting sounds of other people. I sold the cottage without ever setting foot in it again. The estate agent reported some difficulty finding a buyer. Apparently, the place developed a persistent damp problem after that night, a pervasive moisture that resisted all attempts at remediation. It's been 5 years now. I've built a new life in the city, found success with my writing, even cautiously begun dating again. I've convinced myself that what happened that night was indeed some form of waking nightmare, a perfect storm of isolation, stress, and perhaps an undiagnosed mental health issue. And yet, there are nights, particularly when rain lashes against my windows, that I find myself jerking awake at precisely 3:17 a.m. On those nights, my landline telephone, yes, I still maintain one, despite having excellent mobile reception here, sometimes emits a curious sound. Not quite a ring, more of a faint electronic hum, as if it's considering ringing but hasn't quite committed to the action. I never answer it. I've learned that much, at least, but recently I've begun to notice something troubling. Small things at first. A persistent dampness in the corner of my bedroom despite no obvious leak. Water glasses that appear to have been used while I was out. The faint impression of wet footprints on the bathroom tiles that dry before I can examine them properly. And sometimes, catching my reflection unexpectedly in a window or mirror, I glimpse something wrong in my features. Something hungry. Something that isn't me. Wearing my face with imperfect precision. It found me again. It followed me, patient and persistent, from the Yorkshire moors to the heart of London. It seeped through cracks I know existed, flowed along channels I couldn't see. And now it waits, biding its time, growing stronger with each rainy night. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it is. I only know that it's here. And that one night, perhaps tonight, with the rain tapping against my window like impatient fingers, the telephone will ring properly. And this time, there may be no warning, no escape route, no second chance. Sometimes I consider answering that faintly humming phone, hoping to hear my mother's voice again, hoping for another warning, another chance at survival. But deeper down, I fear it wouldn't be her voice on the line this time. It would be my voice, speaking with that hunger that isn't human, inviting me to open a door that should remain forever closed. So I lie awake, listening to the rain, watching the digital clock count its way toward 3:17 a.m., and I wonder, are you listening to this in the dark? Are you alone? And if you think you are, how can you be certain? The rain finds its way through any crack, any gap, any momentary weakness. And sometimes something comes with it. Something that watches and waits and wears your face when you aren't looking. Check your doors. Check your windows. And if your telephone rings in the dead of night, let it go to voicemail. There's something about the sound of rain on a lighthouse. It's different from rain anywhere else. More immediate, more encompassing. The drumming against glass from all sides. The way it seems to isolate you completely from the world. Perhaps that's why I didn't mind being assigned to Black Rock Lighthouse for my first solo posting. The isolation didn't frighten me. In fact, I welcomed it. Have you ever wanted to disappear from your own life? To step away so completely that you might as well be a ghost? That's where I was mentally when I accepted the position. 3 months alone at a partially automated lighthouse off the Northumberland coast. No visitors, limited internet connectivity, just daily maintenance tasks, weather reports, and the occasional emergency response if a vessel came into trouble nearby. The lighthouse service had been hesitant to assign me there, especially as a relative newcomer. Black Rock has a reputation, my supervisor had said, not quite meeting my eyes during the briefing. When I pressed him on what he meant, he'd shrugged and muttered something about keeper temperament and how the isolation affected different people in different ways. But I was insistent, and they were short-staffed, so eventually they relented. I arrived on a Tuesday in late September, transported to the lighthouse by the supply boat that would return only once a month to deliver provisions and collect weather data that couldn't be transmitted electronically. The structure itself rose from a rocky outcrop about 2 miles offshore, a white tower with a black band near the top, standing approximately 120 feet high. Not particularly remarkable as lighthouses go, though it dated back to 1853 and had been in continuous operation since then. The supply boat captain, a weathered local man named Thorne, seemed reluctant to linger once we'd unloaded my belongings and the month's provisions. "You got the satellite phone for emergencies," he reminded me as he prepared to cast off. "But best not use it unless absolutely necessary. Battery life and all that." I nodded, having been briefed thoroughly on protocols. "And whatever you do," he added, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper despite there being no one else to hear, "don't answer the door during storms." I laughed, thinking it was some sort of local joke. "What door? We're on a lighthouse in the middle of the sea." His expression remained deadly serious. "Just remember what I said. No matter what you hear, no matter how desperate it sounds, during storms, you keep that door locked." Before I could question him further, he'd started the boat's engine and pulled away, leaving me alone with the lighthouse, the churning sea, and his cryptic warning. The interior of the lighthouse was more comfortable than I'd expected. The living quarters consisted of several small rooms arranged in a circular pattern around the central staircase that led up to the light and lens apparatus. There was a compact but functional kitchen, a study lined with logbooks dating back decades, a bedroom with a surprisingly comfortable-looking bed, and a small bathroom with a shower that drew filtered rainwater. The decor was utilitarian but not austere. Previous keepers had left their mark in small ways, from nautical decorations to a collection of well-thumbed paperbacks on the shelves. I spent that first day familiarizing myself with the systems, the automated light mechanisms that I would need to maintain, and occasionally override, the weather monitoring equipment, the backup generators in case of power failure. Everything was in good working order, though much of the technology was older than what I'd trained on. Black Rock was one of the few lighthouses that hadn't been completely modernized, partly due to its isolated location, and partly, I suspected, because the Lighthouse Service recognized the historical value of maintaining some of the original operating procedures. That night, I stood on the gallery that encircled the lantern room and watched as darkness settled over the North Sea. The light above me came to life automatically at sunset, sending its powerful beams sweeping across the waters. In the distance, I could make out the lights of the mainland, a thin string of golden pinpricks marking the coastline. I felt a profound sense of peace, of detachment from the complications I'd left behind. Here, I was reduced to my function: keep the light burning, monitor the weather, maintain the equipment. Simple, essential, anonymous. The first week passed uneventfully. I settled into a routine: maintenance in the morning, weather readings at noon, log entries in the afternoon, and evenings spent reading or watching the sea from the gallery. If I felt any loneliness, it was a comfortable kind, a chosen solitude rather than an imposed one. The weather held fair, unusually so for late September in the North Sea. Calm waters, clear skies, gentle breezes. I began to think that perhaps the lighthouse's reputation for being difficult was undeserved, a superstition perpetuated by those uncomfortable with solitude. Then came the first storm. It arrived with little warning. The barometer had been dropping steadily throughout the day, but nothing in the forecast had suggested anything beyond moderate rainfall. By sunset, however, dark clouds had massed on the horizon, moving toward the lighthouse with alarming speed. The wind picked up dramatically, howling around the tower with a voice that seemed almost human in its modulations. Now a high keen, now a deep moan. I secured everything on the exterior of the lighthouse that might be damaged by high winds, then retreated inside, double-checking that the heavy main door at the base of the tower was firmly locked. The automated systems would keep the light functioning regardless of the weather, but I made my way up to the lantern room anyway, wanting to be sure everything was operating as it should. The view from the top was both terrifying and exhilarating. The sea had transformed from its placid state into a heaving mass of white-capped waves that crashed against the rocky base of the lighthouse with explosive force. The sky was a cauldron of black clouds lit from within by occasional flashes of lightning. Rain hadn't yet started falling, but I could see it approaching, a great curtain sweeping across the... I checked the light, confirmed it was operating at full power, and decided to return to the living quarters. I'd barely started down the spiral staircase when the rain hit. It didn't arrive gradually, but seemed to engulf the entire lighthouse in a single moment, hammering against the windows with such violence that I feared the glass might shatter. By the time I reached the kitchen, the full force of the storm had enveloped Blackrock. The lighthouse creaked and groaned under the onslaught, though I knew rationally that it had withstood far worse over its 170-year history. Still, alone in that howling darkness, it was difficult not to anthropomorphize the sounds, to hear voices in the wind, to interpret the random creaks as deliberate movement. I made tea, more for the comforting ritual than from any real desire for it, and tried to focus on a book, but concentration was impossible with the cacophony outside. Instead, I found myself listening to the storm, tracking its moods and movements as it raged around my solitary tower. It was during one of the brief lulls, when the wind temporarily abated between gusts, that I heard it, a knocking, 3 distinct raps against the main door at the base of the lighthouse. I froze, teacup halfway to my lips. It couldn't be. The door was 40 feet below me at the base of the tower. More importantly, there was no way anyone could be outside that door. It opened directly over the rocks, with no pier or landing stage. The only access was by boat to a small crane-operated platform on the opposite side, and no boat could possibly navigate the waters in this storm. I must have imagined it, the wind playing tricks, perhaps blowing debris against the door. Then it came again, louder, more insistent. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate in their execution. I set down my tea and moved to the narrow window that overlooked the base of the tower. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could make out the white-capped waves crashing over the rocks, but nothing else. No boat, no human figure. Nothing that could be knocking at the door. A memory surfaced. The boat captain's warning. Don't answer the door during storms. I hadn't taken him seriously then. I was taking him very seriously now. The knocking came a third time, harder than before, the sound somehow carrying clearly over the roar of the storm. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. There's no one there, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. It's just a storm. As if in direct response to my words, a voice called up from below. Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help. The voice was male, young, desperate. It rose above the storm with unnatural clarity. I moved away from the window, my heart pounding against my ribs. This wasn't possible. There couldn't be anyone out there. And yet, the voice came again. Please, I've been shipwrecked. I can see your light. Please, just open the door. Despite my fear, or perhaps because of it, I found myself moving toward the spiral staircase. Not to open the door, I told myself, just to get a better look, to convince myself there was no one actually out there. I descended slowly, the metal steps cold beneath my bare feet. The voice continued calling, becoming more desperate, more pleading with each repetition. By the time I reached the lowest level, it had taken on a quality that tugged at something primal within me. The instinct to help, to rescue, to save. The main door of the lighthouse was made of solid oak banded with iron, designed to withstand the worst the North Sea could throw at it. A small viewing port I leveled, covered with thick glass, allowed the keeper to look outside without opening the door. I approached cautiously, listening to the voice still calling from the other side. I can hear you in there. Please, I'm injured. I won't survive much longer out here. I reached for the viewing port cover, hesitated, then pulled it open. Rain immediately spattered through the small opening, hitting my face in icy droplets. I blinked against the moisture and peered out into the darkness. The exterior light above the door cast a feeble glow over the immediate area, enough to illuminate the rain and the wet rocks, but little else. At first, I saw nothing, just the storm-tossed sea beyond the rocks, the rain falling in sheets. Then movement caught my eye, a figure, standing impossibly on a rock that was alternately covered and exposed by the surging waves. A man, or what appeared to be a man, drenched and clinging to the rock with one hand, while gesturing desperately toward the door with the other. "Thank God!" he called, his voice somehow perfectly audible despite the howling wind. "Please, open the door. I can't hold on much longer." I stared, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. There was no way anyone could be standing where he was. The rocks were inundated by waves every few seconds. The force of the water would have swept away any human instantly, and yet there he stood, imploring me with outstretched hand. "Who are you?" I called through the viewing port. "How did you get there?" The figure seemed to hesitate, just for a moment, before responding. My boat capsized. I managed to swim to the lighthouse. "Please, I'm freezing to death out here." Something wasn't right, beyond the physical impossibility of the position. There was something off about the way he moved. Too fluid for someone supposedly injured and half-drowned. And his voice. It didn't sound like it was coming through the viewing port, but seemed to be emanating from inside my own head. Captain Thorne's warning echoed in my memory. No matter what you hear, no matter how desperate it sounds, during storms, you keep that door locked. I began to close the viewing port. "Wait!" the figure cried, his voice suddenly changing, deepening into something that bore little resemblance to human speech. "Don't you recognize me?" I froze, the cover halfway closed. "What did you say?" The figure moved closer, approaching the door with an unnatural gliding motion. The exterior light flickered, failing momentarily before coming back on. In that brief flash of darkness and subsequent illumination, the figure changed. It was still humanoid, still had the general outline of a man, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs too long, its torso too narrow, and its face... God help me, it had no face. Just smooth, pale skin where features should have been. "Let me in," it said, its voiceless words somehow perfectly audible inside my skull. "I've been waiting so long. We have so much to discuss, you and I." Terror paralyzed me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Couldn't tear my gaze away from the thing that now pressed itself against the door, its featureless face just inches from the viewing port. "Don't you want to know why you're really here?" it continued, its tone almost conversational now. "Why you were so eager to isolate yourself from everyone who cared about you. Why this lighthouse called to you specifically." A wave crashed over the rocks, momentarily obscuring the figure. When the water receded, it was closer still, impossibly so, its blank face now filling the entire viewing port. "They all come back eventually," it whispered. "All the keepers, whether they want to or not. The sea claims what belongs to it." With a cry of terror that I didn't recognize as my own, I slammed the viewing port shut and locked it. Then I turned and ran up the spiral staircase, taking the steps two at a time, not stopping until I reached the living quarters, where I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, gasping for breath. The knocking resumed almost immediately, not at the main door this time, but at each window of the living quarters in turn, as if the thing outside was circling the lighthouse, testing each possible entrance. The perfect rhythm never varied. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, again and again, growing neither more nor less urgent, as if it had infinite patience. I huddled on the floor, covering my ears, trying to block out the sound. But the knocking continued all through the night, accompanied now by the thing's voice, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, sometimes speaking with terrible intimacy about things from my past that no stranger could possibly know. It knew about the breakdown I'd suffered 6 months ago after my fiancée left me. It knew about the thoughts of suicide that had plagued me in the aftermath. It knew my deepest fears, my most closely guarded secrets, my most shameful desires. "Let me in," it kept saying. "Let me in and all your pain will end. Let me in and you'll never be alone again." Somewhere in the small hours of the morning, exhausted beyond measure, I must have fallen into a fitful sleep despite the constant knocking and whispering. When I woke, pale daylight was filtering through the windows and the storm had passed. The sea outside was calm, almost peaceful, showing no evidence of the previous night's violence. And the knocking had stopped. I rose stiffly from the floor, every muscle protesting after hours spent in a cramped, defensive position. Moving cautiously to the nearest window, I peered out. Nothing but clear sky, placid waters, and the distant coastline shimmering in the morning light. Had I imagined it all? A hallucination brought on by isolation and the stress of the storm? I wanted to believe that, needed to believe it. But when I finally gathered the courage to descend to the base of the lighthouse and check the main door, I found unmistakable evidence that something had been outside. There on the thick oak surface were marks, Not scratches or gouges as might be made by a tool or weapon, but perfect indentations that mirrored a human hand. 5 fingerprints pressed into the solid wood as if it had temporarily softened like clay. The prints were abnormally elongated. The fingers too long and thin to belong to any person I'd ever encountered. I retreated back up the stairs and spent the day in a state of nervous exhaustion, jumping at every sound, checking and rechecking that all entrances to the lighthouse were securely locked. I considered using the satellite phone to call for evacuation, but found myself hesitating. What would I say? That a faceless entity had knocked on my door during a storm? That it knew things about me it couldn't possibly know? I'd be labeled unstable, possibly relieved of my position. The thought of returning to the mainland, to the life I'd so desperately wanted to escape, was almost as frightening as what I'd experienced during the night. So I said nothing. I entered a carefully sanitized version of events in the logbook, noting the unexpected storm but omitting any mention of visitors, and tried to convince myself that it had been a temporary break in reality that wouldn't recur. The next few days passed without incident. The weather remained fair. I gradually began to relax, to settle back into my routine. But I found myself watching the barometer obsessively, noting with increasing anxiety as it began to drop again a week after the first storm. The second storm arrived at nightfall, just as the first had. The same sudden transformation of the sea, the same howling wind, the same violent rain. I secured the lighthouse and retreated to the living quarters. But this time I didn't pretend to read or make tea. I sat facing the windows, waiting. The knocking began precisely at midnight. 3 raps, pause, 3 raps, moving from window to window, as before. And with it, the voice, now familiar in its terrible intimacy. "You know you can't keep me out forever," it said. "This lighthouse has stood for over a century and a half. Do you know how many keepers have tried to deny me? They all let me in eventually." I remained silent, hands pressed over my ears, eyes squeezed shut, but its voice penetrated effortlessly into my mind. Shall I tell you about them? About Edward Marsh, the first keeper, who lasted almost a year before he opened the door. About William Thorne, who tied himself to the railing to prevent himself from answering my call, only to find the ropes mysteriously loosened during the night. I opened my eyes at that. Thorne, the same surname as the boat captain who had warned me. Was it coincidence? Or had his warning come from familial experience? Oh, yes. The voice continued, as if it followed my train of thought. The Thorns have a long history with this lighthouse. They've lost many men to its keeping over the generations. Your captain is the last of his line, and he knows to stay safely ashore during storms. The knocking intensified, no longer confined to windows, but seeming to come from all around me. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling, as if the entire lighthouse was being used as a percussion instrument by something huge and patient and hungry. "Why are you doing this?" I finally cried out. "What do you want from me?" The knocking stopped abruptly. Silence fell, so profound after the constant noise that it seemed a physical presence. "I want what I always want," the voice replied softly. "Communion, completion. I am the sea and the storm and the darkness between stars. I am ancient beyond your comprehension, and I am so very lonely." There was such profound sadness in those last words that, despite my terror, I felt an answering pang within my own soul. Hadn't I come to this lighthouse, seeking escape from my own loneliness? Wasn't that isolation, that separation from human connection, exactly what had driven me to accept this posting? As if sensing my moment of empathy, the voice grew gentler more enticing. We are alike, you and I, both outside, looking in, both yearning for understanding that never comes. I can give you what you seek. An end to loneliness, an end to pain, an end to the desperate grasping after meaning in a meaningless existence. I found myself moving toward the window without conscious decision. The thing was outside. Its blank face pressed against the glass, those two long fingers splayed across the transparent surface. That's it. It encouraged. You understand now, don't you? It's not death I offer. It's transformation, becoming something greater than your limited human existence could ever encompass. My hand rose, seemingly of its own accord, toward the window latch. Join with me, the thing whispered. Open a window. Let me in. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the latch. Just a simple turn, a small movement, and the barrier between us would be gone. The loneliness would end. The pain would stop. I would become something else. Something more. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the scene with stark clarity. And in that moment of brilliant light, I saw the truth behind the thing's featureless face. Saw what waited for me if I opened the window. What had always been waiting. Not just for me, but for every keeper who had served at Blackrock. It wasn't communion. It wasn't completion. It was consumption. Total and irrevocable. I snatched my hand away from the latch as if burned. No! I said, my voice barely audible even to myself. Then louder, with growing conviction. No, I don't consent. I don't invite you in. The thing pressed harder against the glass, its blank face somehow expressing rage despite its lack of features. The entire lighthouse seemed to shudder as the storm intensified, waves crashing against the base with renewed fury. You have no choice, the voice roared, all pretense of gentleness gone. They never have a choice in the end. The door will open, whether by your hand or by mine. As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent wave struck the lighthouse, sending vibrations through the entire structure. A hairline crack appeared in the window glass, spreading slowly from one corner toward the center. I backed away, looking frantically around the room for anything that might reinforce the window. But I knew, with a certainty that transcended rational thought, that nothing material would keep this entity out if it truly turned its full attention to gaining entrance. It was then that I noticed the logbooks lining the study walls. Dozens of them, dating back to the lighthouse's construction, the recorded experiences of every keeper who had served at Blackrock. Perhaps within those pages was information that could help me, some ritual or ward or knowledge accumulated by my predecessors. I grabbed the oldest logbook from the shelf and began to flip through it, scanning the faded handwriting for anything relevant. Most entries were mundane, weather reports, maintenance tasks, supply inventories. But as I continued searching, I began to notice a pattern. Certain storms are described in greater detail than others, with oblique references to disturbances or unusual phenomena. And following these entries, there were often gaps, days or weeks where no entries were made, followed by entries in a different handwriting, indicating a new keeper had taken over. The knocking had resumed, more frantic now. The crack in the window glass continued to spread, branching into multiple fissures that spider-webbed across the surface. I didn't have much time. Guided by some instinct, I pulled down a logbook from about 30 years ago and began searching through it. The keeper during that period had been more explicit in his entries than most, describing visitants during storms and malign influences attempting entry. And then, in an entry dated October 17, 1992, I found what I was looking for. It cannot enter unless invited, the keeper had written. the script increasingly frantic as the entry continued. This is the one inviolable rule. No matter its persuasions, its threats, its promises, it requires invitation, a door opened, a window unlatched, a word of welcome. Without these, it remains outside, though it may rage and batter at the walls. The window glass gave an ominous crack as another fissure formed. The thing outside pressed its face against the weakening barrier, its blank visage now somehow contorted with fury despite its lack of features. "You are mine," it howled, its voice penetrating through both the glass and my attempt to block it out. "This lighthouse is mine. All who dwell within it are mine to take." But I understood now. It was ancient and powerful, yes, but not omnipotent. It had rules it must follow, limitations to its reach. It could knock and call and persuade, but it could not enter unless invited. This was why it had used the appearance of a shipwrecked sailor during the first storm, hoping to appeal to my humanitarian instincts. This was why it now spoke of loneliness and understanding, trying to forge a connection that might lead to invitation. "I do not invite you," I said firmly, standing as far from the window as the room would allow. "I do not welcome you. I do not consent to your entry. This lighthouse is under my keeping, and you have..." The thing howled, a sound of such primal rage that the remaining intact portions of the window glass vibrated in sympathy. The storm outside reached a new level of intensity, waves crashing against the lighthouse with such force that I feared the entire structure might give way. Invitation or no, but it held. The lighthouse had been built to withstand the worst the North Sea could deliver, and despite the entity's fury, the physical storm it had summoned was still bound by natural laws. For hours, I sat in the center of the room, repeating my denial like a mantra. "I do not invite you. I do not welcome you. I do not consent." The storm raged, the thing howled and threatened, but the broken window, though damaged, did not give way. As dawn approached, the storm began to abate. The knocking grew less frequent, the voice more distant. When the first pale light of morning touched the horizon, the presence outside the window gave one final, thwarted howl and then was gone, leaving only the gentle lapping of waves against the base of the lighthouse and the distant cry of seabirds. I approached the damaged window cautiously. The glass was cracked beyond repair, and I would need to secure it somehow before the next storm. But there was no sign of the entity that had raged against it throughout the night. Over the following days, I went through every logbook in the lighthouse, piecing together the history that had never been officially recorded. BlackRock had claimed more keepers than any other lighthouse in service, not through accident or illness or the mundane hazards of position, but through the entity that called itself the sea and the storm and the darkness between stars. Those keepers who had survived their posting had done so by understanding the one inviolable rule. It could not enter without invitation. Those who had disappeared, and there were many, had either opened the door out of compassion for what they perceived as a fellow human in distress, or had eventually given in to the promises of an end to loneliness. I repaired the window as best I could with materials from the lighthouse's maintenance stores. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it would hold until the monthly supply boat returned. And when Captain Thorne arrived, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and relief that told me he hadn't expected to find me alive, I was waiting with a single question. "Your ancestor," I said as he secured his boat to the lifting platform. "William Thorne. He was keeper here once, wasn't he?" Thorne's weathered face gave away nothing, but the slight stiffening of his shoulders was answer enough. "What do you know about that?" he asked cautiously. "I know he almost gave in during a storm," I replied. "I know he tied himself to the railing to prevent himself from opening the door. And I know the ropes were mysteriously loosened during the night. Thorn was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving past me to the lighthouse tower behind. He escaped, he finally said, one of the few who did. Rode away in the middle of a storm, nearly drowned in the attempt, when they found him washed up on the coast. He was raving about something that waited at Black Rock, something that called to him still, even miles away. The Thorns have served as boat captains ever since, I guessed, close enough to monitor the lighthouse, far enough to stay safe from its influence. He nodded, then fixed me with an intense gaze. You've seen it then, and survived. That makes you either very strong or very lucky. Neither, I admit it. I just understand the rules now. It can't enter unless invited. That's only part of the truth, Thorn said grimly. Yes, it needs invitation to enter, but once you've encountered it, once it knows you, it never stops calling. My family has heard the knocking during storms for generations, even miles from Black Rock, not as strongly as at the lighthouse itself, but present nonetheless. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the September breeze. You mean, even if I leave, it will find you during storms, he confirmed. It will knock at your window, your door. It will call with the voices of those you love, those you've lost. It will promise an end to loneliness, an end to pain. It will never stop, not until your final day, when your resistance has been worn down to nothing and you finally, fatally, open the door. I looked back at the lighthouse, its white tower gleaming in the morning sun, the black band near the top absorbing light, like a void in the fabric of reality. I had come here seeking escape from my life, from my pain. I had found something far worse than anything I had left behind. Take me back to the mainland, I said quietly. I need to report the window damage and request reassignment. Thorn's expression held a mixture of pity and understanding. It won't help, you know. Wherever you go, whatever you do, during storms you'll hear it knocking. 3 times, pause 3 times again. I nodded, accepting the truth of his words. Then I'll have to make sure I never answer, won't I? That was 5 years ago. I did leave the lighthouse service, though not the coast. Something in me couldn't bear to move too far inland, away from the sea that had become both my terror and my strange obsession. I took a position at the coastal weather station, monitoring the same storms that bring my visitor, but from the safety of a modern building with multiple colleagues and state-of-the-art security systems. Thorn was right. It found me just as he said it would. During storms, when rain lashes against my windows and wind howls around the eaves of my small cottage, I hear the knocking. 3 times, pause, 3 times again. Sometimes it calls of my own voice, sometimes with the voices of those I've loved and lost. Always it promises an end to loneliness, an end to fear, an end to the weary vigilance that has become my life. I've learned to live with it, this unwanted companionship that arrives with every storm. I've taken precautions, no doors or windows that can be easily opened from within during my moment of weakness, timers that lock them automatically when barometric pressure drops below a certain point, indicating but I wonder in my darker moments how long I can maintain this vigilance, how many storms I can endure before fatigue or despair or simple human error leads to that fatal invitation. How many nights I can lie awake, listening to the knocking, before I begin to wonder if whatever waits on the other side might not be worse than this half-life of perpetual resistance. Sometimes, when the rain drums against my windows with particular insistence, I find myself thinking of all the keepers who came before me, those who resisted and those who gave in. I wonder they found peace, those who opened their doors. If the thing's promises of an end to loneliness were fulfilled, albeit not in the way they might have hoped. And I wonder about you listening to this now. Are you safe and dry, sheltered from storms? Or is rain pattering against your window as you hear my words? If so, listen carefully to its rhythm. Is it random, as natural rainfall should be? Or do you detect a pattern emerging? 3 drops, a pause. 3 drops again? And if you do hear that pattern, remember the one inviolable rule. It cannot enter unless invited, no matter how it knocks, no matter how it calls, no matter what form it takes or what promises it makes. Do not open the door. Have you ever noticed how the sound of rain seems to transform ordinary objects? The way it creates a cocoon of white noise that isolates you from the world, drawing your attention to things you might otherwise overlook? The way it emphasizes silence when it briefly pauses, making you suddenly aware of sound that were always there just beneath your notice? I've always found rain soothing. Growing up in a small village in the Lake District, I became accustomed to its constant presence. The gentle patter against windows, the rhythmic drumming on the slate roof of our cottage, the distant rushing of swollen streams. When I moved to London for university, the thing I missed most was not the mountains or the clean air, but a particular quality of rain falling on rural silence, unmarred by traffic or sirens or the general hum of urban existence. That's why I was so drawn to the antique radio I found in Camden Market 3 years ago. It was a beautiful piece, a 1940s Bakelite model in an aged wooden case, brass dials, and the warm, inviting glow of vacuum tubes visible through the ventilation slats at the back. The elderly woman selling it noticed my interest and approached as I was examining it. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice carrying the same northern lilt as my grandmother's. My late husband was a collector, restored this one himself back in the 80s. I nodded, running my fingers over the finely crafted wooden casing. "It's lovely. Does it still work?" "Oh, yes," she replied, though it's temperamental. Seems to have preferences about when it wants to receive a signal. Works best during rainstorms, funnily enough. I laughed at that. Perfect for London, then. She named a price that was lower than I'd expected for such a well-preserved piece. I didn't haggle, sensing that she was more concerned with finding the right home for her husband's handiwork than with making a profit. As I was paying, she placed a hand on my arm. "Just one thing," she said, her expression suddenly serious. "If you hear something unusual on it, something that doesn't seem like a regular broadcast, it's best to turn it off straight away. My herald always said some signals aren't meant to be received." I assumed this was just the sort of eccentricity one expected from elderly Londoners, that peculiar blend of superstition and worldliness that comes from surviving the Blitz and all the decades since. I thanked her, promised to take good care of the radio, and carried my new purchase back to my small flat in Kentish Town. The radio found a home on my bedside table, where I could reach it easily on those nights when insomnia kept me awake. I didn't actually expect it to work, despite the woman's assurances. It was more an aesthetic choice than a practical one. A piece of craftsmanship from an era when objects were built to last and to please the eye. So I was pleasantly surprised when, during a particularly fierce autumn storm a few weeks later, I switched it on and was rewarded with perfect reception. The warm, rich sound quality was unlike anything produced by modern digital radios. There was a depth to it, a presence that made it sound as if the BBC presenter was sitting in a room with me, reading the late-night news directly into my ear. I fell asleep to the gentle burr of Radio 4, the sound mingling with the rain against my window in a comforting symphony that reminded me of home. That might have been the end of it, just a charming antique that happened to function as well as it looked. But then came the night of the great storm, the night everything changed. It was early December, and London was being battered by what the meteorologists were calling a weather bomb, A rapid drop in pressure bringing gale-force winds and sheets of rain that seemed to fall horizontally rather than vertically. The kind of night where even the most determined Londoners abandon the streets for the sanctuary of home or pub. I'd been working late, editing a manuscript for the small publishing house where I'd found employment after graduation. By the time I finally closed my laptop, it was well past midnight, and the storm had reached its full, ferocious intensity. Rain lashed against my windows with such force that I checked twice to ensure they were properly closed. The wind found every tiny gap in the old building structure, creating an eerie chorus of whistles and moans that seemed to circle the flat. Sleep would be impossible without some form of audio distraction to mask the storm cacophony. I reached for the antique radio, switched it on, and turned the tuning dial, expecting to find a comforting drone of the BBC World Service. Instead, I encountered static, not the complete absence of signal, but that peculiar, shifting white noise that suggests a station just beyond the reach of clear reception. I continued turning the dial slowly, searching for something recognizable. The static suddenly cleared, giving way to what sounded like a voice. Not the polished tones of a professional broadcaster, but something more hesitant, more intimate. A man's voice, speaking softly, as if afraid of being overheard. Still raining, he was saying, his words occasionally obscured by bursts of static. Day 17. Supplies holding out, but the water keeps rising. If anyone can hear this, we're at Meadowbank Farm, about 3 miles east of Keswick. Family of 4, plus 2 neighbors who were stranded when the bridge went. We need... The transmission cut out, giving way to more static. I sat up, suddenly alert. This wasn't a professional broadcast. It sounded like an emergency transmission, perhaps from a ham radio operator. And Meadowbank Farm, that was no more than 10 miles from my childhood home in the lakes. I adjusted the dial minutely, trying to recapture the signal. The static ebbed and flowed, occasionally allowing fragments of speech to emerge. Higher ground impossible with the children, youngest running a fever now. Please, if anyone is receiving this... The voice sounded desperate, frightened. I felt a surge of concern. Was this happening now? Was a family trapped by flooding in the Lake District at this very moment? It wasn't implausible. The region was prone to devastating floods, and the same storm system currently battering London could well be affecting the north. I reached for my phone, thinking I should perhaps call the Cumbria Police or Mountain Rescue to report what I was hearing. But before I could dial, the quality of the transmission changed. The static diminished, and the voice came through with sudden, startling clarity. "I know you can hear me," it said. "Yes, you, sitting in your bedroom in Kentish Town, listening to a radio that doesn't belong to you." I froze, phone in hand, a chill spreading through me that had nothing to do with a December night. How could the person on the radio possibly know where I was, or that I was listening? "You're confused," the voice continued, as if responding to my unspoken questions. "That's understandable, but I don't have time to explain properly. The waters of the second floor are landing now, and the roof won't hold much longer. I need you to deliver a message." My rational mind scrambled for explanations. This had to be a prank, perhaps played by the previous owner, or someone who knew I'd purchased a radio. But how would they know when I'd be listening? And the voice sounded genuinely terrified, the fear too real to be feigned. A message to whom? I heard myself asking aloud, as if the radio could transmit my voice as well as receive. To my shock, the voice answered. "To Mary, Mary Sutton. Tell her that James is sorry, that he should have listened when she warned him about the old watermarks on the beams. Tell her the children are with me, and we're not afraid anymore." The name meant nothing to me. I had no connection to anyone called Mary Sutton, yet the voice spoke with such urgency, such specificity, that I found myself reaching for a pen to write down the message. Mary Sutton, I repeated, writing the name. And you are James? James Sutton, yes. The voice, James, sounded relieved, as if grateful to be understood. We bought Meadowbank in 1952, after the war. Mary didn't want to. Said the house had been rebuilt too many times, always in the same flood-prone spot. But I was stubborn, thought I knew better. 1952? I stared at the radio, my confusion deepening. If this man had bought a farm in 1952, he'd be in his 90s now, at minimum, when... I swallowed hard, afraid to ask, but needing to know. What are you speaking from, James? A burst of static partially obscured his response, but I caught fragments. November 1954, worst rains in living memory. Derwent burst its banks 3 days ago. A cold weight settled in my stomach. November 1954. I wasn't receiving a current emergency broadcast. Somehow, impossibly, I was listening to a transmission from nearly 70 years in past. As if sensing my realization, the voice became more urgent. The radio is a conduit. It always has been. Something about the copper wiring, a particular arrangement of components. Harold understood that. He built it to receive frequencies beyond the normal range. Harold, the late husband of the woman who'd sold me the radio, the one who'd warned about unusual broadcasts. But why me? I asked, why am I receiving your transmission? The storm, James replied, his voice now competing with increasing static. It creates a thinning between then and now. And you're receptive, open to the possibility. Most people would have turned the dial at the first sign of something unusual. But you listened. Another surge of static nearly drowned his voice completely. When it cleared, his tone had changed. The desperation was gone, replaced by a strange calm. It's too late for us now, he said softly. The water's coming in through the attic window. But Mary survived. She was visiting her sister in Penrith when the floods came. She's lived with the guilt all these years, thinking if she'd been here, she might have convinced me to evacuate sooner. I need her to know that it wasn't her fault, that we're at peace. I was taking notes frantically now, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. But Mary would be. She must be very elderly now, if she's even still alive. How am I supposed to find her? She's alive, James said with quiet certainty. Living in a care home in Grasmere. The Oaklea. Harold found her there 5 years ago. Your time, not mine. He promised to deliver my message. But his heart gave out before he could. The radio came to you for a reason. I wanted to ask how he could possibly know these details about the future. His future, my present. But the static was increasing steadily, his voice becoming harder to discern. The connection won't hold much longer, he said, now barely audible beneath the crackling interference. Water and electricity don't mix, even across the decades. Find her, please. Tell her we love her and we're waiting. Tell her. His voice cut out completely, replaced by a high-pitched whine that made me wince and lunge to the volume control. As my fingers touched the knob, a surge of electricity sparked from the radio. I jerked back with a cry of pain, shaking my hand to dispel the sharp sting. The radio fell silent, not just free of voices or static, but completely, unnaturally silent. When I cautiously touched the power button again, nothing happened. The vacuum tubes, which had been glowing with that warm, inviting light, remained dark and lifeless. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to the rain continuing to lash against the windows, try and make sense of what had just happened. Had I dozed off while working and dreamt entire exchange? Had I been the victim of an elaborate hoax? Or had I actually received a transmission from a man who had died in a flood nearly 70 years ago? The rational part of my mind insisted on one of the first two explanations. People don't communicate across decades via antique radios. The laws of physics don't allow it. And yet, the paper on which I'd written James Sutton's message sat on my bedside table, the handwriting unmistakably my own. I barely slept that night. When dawn finally arrived, a gray, sullen lightening of the sky rather than a proper sunrise, the storm had passed, leaving London drenched and debris-strewn but otherwise intact. The radio remained lifeless, resisting all my attempts to revive it. I told myself to forget the incident, to focus on work, on the approaching holidays, on 1,000 small concerns of everyday life. The radio had suffered an electrical failure during the storm, nothing more. Any voices I'd heard were product of my imagination, or perhaps fragments of actual broadcast distorted by static and my own fatigue. But I couldn't stop thinking about Mary Sutton, about the care home in Grasmere, about the message I'd supposedly been entrusted to deliver. 3 days later, I called Oakley Care Home. Yes, they told me Mary Sutton was indeed a resident there, had been for nearly 12 years. No, she didn't receive many visitors, occasional trips from a niece in Edinburgh, but no one else. Yes, I could visit her if I wished, as a distant family connection, perhaps. I agreed, the lie sitting uncomfortably in my stomach. I took the train to the lakes that weekend, watching the familiar landscape of my childhood unfold beyond the window. The recent storm had left its mark here, too. Fields still partially flooded, rivers running high and fast, emergency repair crews working on damaged infrastructure. Oakley was a pleasant, well-maintained facility on the outskirts of Grasmere, with views of the fells that would have comforted anyone raised in their shadow. The staff were welcoming, seemingly pleased that Mary was receiving an unexpected visitor. She has very good days and not so good days. The care assistant warned me as she led me to Mary's room. She's physically quite well for 92, but her memory can be patchy. Don't be offended if she doesn't recognize you or follows her own conversational paths. I nodded, not bothering to correct the assumption that I was someone Mary should recognize. My stomach was twisted with nerves. What was I doing here? About to distress an elderly woman with a bizarre story of voices on the radio and messages from beyond? I was on the verge of turning back when the assistant knocked on the door and ushered me inside. Mary Sutton sat in an armchair by the window, a tartan blanket across her knees despite the room's warmth. She was tiny bird bone, with a cloud of white hair and deeply lined skin that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. But her eyes, when they turned to me, were startlingly clear and blue, the eyes of a much younger woman, sharp with intelligence and curiosity. "Hello," she said, her voice stronger than I'd expected. "You're not Judith from Edinburgh." I smiled despite my nervousness. "No, I'm not. My name is Emily. I hope you don't mind the visit." She studied me with those penetrating blue eyes. "You've come about James," she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Finally, the word stopped me cold. I stared at her, unable to formulate a response. "Don't look so shocked, dear," she continued, gesturing to a chair opposite hers. "I've been expecting someone since Harold died. He told me the radio would find its way to the right person eventually, that the message would get through." I sank into the offered chair. You know about the radio?" I managed. Mary nodded. "Harold Brewer. He found me about 5 years ago. Said he had a radio that picked up unusual frequencies during storms. Said he'd heard James on it. Try and get a message to me." Her gaze drifted to the window, to the fells beyond. I thought he was touched in the head. Of course. Grief does strange things to people. His wife, Emily, your namesake, that's interesting. She was more pragmatic. Try to keep him from bothering me with such nonsense. I pulled the paper with my hastily scribbled notes from my pocket. "Mrs. Sutton, I know this sounds impossible, but during the storm 3 nights ago, I heard a man on that same radio. He said his name was James Sutton. He asked me to deliver a message to you. Mary's eyes snapped back to me, suddenly intent. What message? He said. I consulted my notes, though I had memorized the words. He said he was sorry, that he should have listened when you warned him about the old watermarks on the beams. He said the children are with him, and they're not afraid anymore. The change in Mary's expression was immediate and profound. The polite interest vanished, replaced by naked shock, and then, slowly, a grief so raw that I had to look away. He said that, she whispered. Those exact words. I nodded, regretting now that I had come, that I had reopened such an obviously painful wound. Mrs. Sutton, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. No, she interrupted, her voice surprisingly firm. No, you were right to come, to tell me. Her thin hand reached out, gripping mine with unexpected strength. You couldn't have known those words. About the watermarks. I never told anyone about that conversation. It was our last argument, before I left for my sister's. I told him the old watermarks on the attic beams showed how high the floods could reach. He said they were probably just stains from a leaking roof. She released my hand, her gaze turning inward, seeing something beyond the room, beyond the present moment. The Derwent flooded on November 15, 1954, she said quietly. Worst floods in living memory. They called it. 17 people died. My James, our 2 children, and the Cooper family from the next farm over. They'd come to us when their own homes started flooding. The authorities didn't find the bodies for weeks. The current had carried them miles downstream. I'm so sorry, I said inadequately. She didn't seem to hear me. I always thought, if I'd been there, I might have convinced them to leave sooner, might have saved them. I've carried that guilt for 68 years. That's why he contacted me. I said gently, he wanted you to know it wasn't your fault, that they're at peace. Mary was silent for a long moment, her aged face working through emotions I couldn't begin to fathom. Grief and wonder, and perhaps, underlying it all, a hint of relief. Do you believe in an afterlife, Emily? She finally asked. The question caught me off guard. I don't know. I admit it. She nodded, as if my answer was expected. I didn't either before the flood. Went to church like everyone else. But it was social more than spiritual. After I lost them, I looked for comfort wherever I could find it. Consulted mediums, attended seances, desperate for some sign that they still existed somewhere. She smiled faintly. Never found it. Not until Harold Brewer showed up with his talker voices on the radio. And now do you think it was really him? I asked. James, actually him. Somehow communicating across time. Mary's smile deepened, softening the deep lines of her face. What do you think? I considered the question honestly. I don't know what to think. Logically, it's impossible. But I heard him. He knew things he couldn't have known. Where I live, who you are, where to find you. And he knew about Harold, about the radio coming to me after Harold died. Sometimes, Mary said softly, the universe finds ways to deliver the messages we need most desperately to send or receive. The mechanism doesn't matter so much as the message itself. We talked for another hour about James, about the children, Edward, 7, and Margaret, 5 at the time of the flood, about Mary's life in the aftermath of such devastating loss. She had never remarried, never had other children, had built a life teaching at the local school, tending her garden, quietly preserving the memory of her lost family. When it was time for me to leave, she pressed something into my hand, a small black and white photograph, its edges worn soft with handling. It showed a family group, a tall man with serious expression but kind eyes, a much younger Mary, and 2 children with their father's dark hair and their mother's clear gaze. Take it, she insisted when I tried to return it. I have others, and somehow it seems right that you should have this one after what you did. I promised to visit again, and I meant it, but Mary Sutton died in her sleep 3 nights later. Peacefully, the care home staff assured me when they called with the news. She had seemed especially content in her final days, they said, at peace in a way they hadn't seen before. The radio still sits on my bedside table, though it has never worked again since that stormy night. Sometimes, when rain lashes against my windows and the wind moans around the eaves of my building, I switch it on anyway, just in case, just to see if there might be another message waiting to be delivered, another connection seeking to be made across the impermeable barrier of time. Because now I understand what the elderly seller meant when she warned me about the radio, about signals that weren't meant to be received, not because they were dangerous or malevolent, but because they were profound. Communications that once heard would change your understanding of reality forever. And on the rainiest nights, when the storm reaches its peak intensity and the boundary between now and then seems at its thinnest, I sometimes think I hear something beneath the radio silence. Not voices, not exactly, but a quality of attention, as if somewhere beyond normal perception, someone is trying to reach across the divide. Someone with an urgent message that only the right listener at the right moment might be able to receive. So I keep the radio and I listen during storms. And I wonder who else might be out there, separated from their loved ones not just by distance, but by time itself, desperately trying to deliver one final message. We are at peace. We are waiting. We are loved. Perhaps that's the real storm's voice. Not the howl of wind or the drumming of rain, but the whispered reassurances that somehow find their way through the static across the years, carrying the one truth we all need most desperately to hear, that love persists even when everything else is washed away. Have you ever returned to an empty home and felt, with absolute certainty, that someone had been there in your absence? Not the obvious signs of a break-in. Nothing so dramatic as upturned furniture or missing valuables. I'm talking about the subtle wrongness that prickles at your awareness. A chair angled slightly differently. The faint scent of unfamiliar cologne. The sensation of disturbed air, as if the atmosphere itself remembers another presence. For most of my life, I dismissed such feelings as overactive imagination, the mind's tendency to manufacture patterns from randomness, to create narratives from coincidence. I considered myself rational, grounded, not the sort to indulge in paranoid fantasies about home invaders who leave no trace. That changed 6 months ago when I moved into Blackwood Court. It was a decent enough building, a converted Victorian house in Hampstead, divided into 6 flats, not luxurious, but respectable, with high ceilings and large windows that flooded the rooms with light on those rare sunny London days. My flat was on the top floor, a 1-bedroom affair with sloped ceilings and a small balcony overlooking communal garden. The rent was more than I wanted to pay, but location trumped economy, and I signed a 12-month lease without much hesitation. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I settled into a routine, commuting to my job at a publishing house in Bloomsbury, occasionally socializing with colleagues, more often returning home to read manuscripts late into the night. I met 2 of my neighbors in passing, an elderly woman from the ground floor flat who asked me to accept package deliveries when she was out, and a middle-aged man from the floor below who complained about my footsteps late at night, despite my best efforts to tread lightly. It was approaching winter, and London had settled into its familiar pattern of gray skies and persistent drizzle that occasionally intensified into proper rainfall. I didn't mind. There's something comforting about being indoors during rain, the gentle percussion against windows, the excuse to stay with a book and a cup of tea, the way it transforms the urban landscape into something softer, more forgiving. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday in late November. I'd been at work all day, returning home around 7 in the evening to find my flat exactly as I'd left it. Or so I thought. I made dinner, read for a while, then went to bed. It was only as I was drifting off to sleep that an uneasy feeling crept over me. Something was different. Something had changed. I sat up, switched on the bedside lamp, and looked around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. My clothes were where I'd left them, draped over a chair. My phone was charging on the nightstand. The book I'd been reading was still open to the page I'd reached before turning off the light. And yet, the bedroom door was closed. I never closed my bedroom door. Living alone, there was no need for privacy, and I preferred the sense of openness, the freedom to hear any unusual sounds at night. I tried to recall if I'd broken my habit that evening. If perhaps I'd closed it without thinking while changing clothes or making the bed. But I knew I hadn't. I was certain of it. I got up and opened the door, peering into the darkened flat beyond. Everything was still, silent except for the soft patter of rain against the windows. I checked the front door, locked, chain in place, the windows all secured. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed, just a closed door that should have been open. I told myself it was nothing, a draft, perhaps, the old building settling. I returned to bed, though sleep was a long time coming. The next morning, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. The human mind is remarkably good at gaslighting itself, at rationalizing away the inexplicable in favor of the comfortably mundane. I went to work, spent the day editing a particularly dense historical novel, and by the time I returned home that evening, the incident with the door had receded to a minor curiosity, barely worth remembering, until I stepped into my flat and noticed a chair. It was a simple wooden dining chair, one of two at the small table where I ate breakfast. It had been pulled out and angled toward the center of the room, as if someone had been sitting there, watching the door, waiting for my return. I froze in the entryway, keys still in hand, as a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. This was no draft, no settling building. Someone had been in my flat. I backed out, pulling the door closed behind me, and knocked on my downstairs neighbor's door. The middle-aged man, I'd learned his name was Grayson, answered with a scowl that softened slightly when he saw my expression. "Are you all right?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think someone's been in my flat," I said. "The chair, it's been moved, and yesterday, a door was closed that I never closed." He frowned. "Have you called the police?" "Not yet. I don't know, a witness? Someone to check with me, to make sure I'm not imagining things." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let me get my keys. If there's someone in there, two of us have a better chance than one." We searched the flat together. It wasn't large, and it didn't take long to confirm it was empty. No signs of forced entry. Nothing missing. Just that chair, pulled out and angled toward the door. "Could you have left it like that this morning?" Grayson asked, practical and unimpressed. I shook my head firmly. "No, I always push the chairs in. It's a habit." He shrugged. "Habits can be forgotten. Or maybe there was a maintenance check. The landlord sometimes sends people around to check the boilers or the wiring. They should leave a note, though." It was a reasonable explanation. I thanked him, promising to contact the landlord and check. He left, and I immediately pushed the chair back into its proper place, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The landlord, when I called, denied authorizing any maintenance visits to my flat. He suggested, as Grayson had, that I'd simply forgotten how I'd left things. The patronizing tone in his voice made it clear he thought I was being hysterical. A single woman, frightened by shadows and forgetfulness. I didn't press the issue. For the next week, I was hyper-vigilant. I began taking photographs of my flat before leaving each morning. The dining table with chairs properly pushed in, the bedroom door left open, everything in its place. I checked the locks multiple times before leaving and upon returning. I even considered setting up a camera, but that felt like an overreaction, a step too far into paranoia. Nothing happened. The flat remained exactly as I left it each day, confirmed by my comparative photos. I began to relax, to think that perhaps I had indeed imagined or misremembered things. Perhaps I was more stressed at work than I'd realized, the pressure of deadlines and demanding authors manifesting in this odd anxiety about my living space. Then came the night of the heavy rain. It had been drizzling all day, but as evening approached, the weather intensified into a proper downpour. I left work later than usual, hurrying through rain-slick streets to the underground station, jostling for space among crowds of similarly damp and irritable commuters. By the time I reached my flat, I was soaked despite my umbrella, my mood as dark as the storm clouds overhead. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately sensed something was wrong. The flat was cold, far colder than it should have been, even with the heating off all day. A damp chill permeated the air, as if the rain had somehow found its way indoors, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like wet earth and decaying leaves, like a forest floor after heavy rainfall. I moved cautiously through the entryway into the main living area, flicking on lights as I went. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed. The chairs were where they should be. The bedroom door was open as I had left it. My belongings appeared untouched, but the smell was stronger now, and underneath it, a sound, so subtle I might have missed it if the flat hadn't been otherwise silent. A soft, rhythmic dripping. I followed the sound of the bathroom. The door was closed. Another door I habitually left open, and light spilled from beneath it. A light I knew I hadn't left on that morning. I stood there, water from my coat forming a small puddle at my feet, listening to that steady drip, drip, drip from behind the closed door. I should leave, I thought. Call the police. Call Grayson. Call someone. Instead, I reached for the handle and opened the door. The bathroom was empty of people but full of steam, as if someone had recently showered. The mirror was fogged, the tiles slick with condensation. And in the bathtub, the source of the dripping, the shower head was leaking, a steady patter of droplets hitting the ceramic surface below. I approached slowly, reaching to turn off the tap that had been left slightly open. As my hand touched the cold metal, I noticed something on the mirror. Words, traced by a finger through the condensation. I know you see me. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the wet floor. The bathroom was empty. I'd verified it with my own eyes. Yet someone had written these words recently enough that they hadn't been obscured by the gradually clearing condensation. I backed out of the bathroom and ran to the front door. In my panic, I fumbled with the locks, my cold, wet fingers refusing to cooperate. When I finally wrenched the door open, I collided with someone standing directly outside. I screamed, recoiling before recognizing Grayson. He caught my shoulders, steadying me, his expression alarmed. "What's happened?" he demanded. I heard running, a scream. "Someone's been in my flat." I gasped. "The shower, the mirror, there's a message." He moved past me into the flat, heading toward the bathroom with a confidence I envied. I followed reluctantly, unwilling to be left alone in the hallway, but equally unwilling to re-enter the bathroom. Grayson inspected the shower, the still damp tiles, the mirror, which now showed no trace of message I'd seen moments earlier. The condensation had cleared completely, leaving only a slightly spotty surface that reflected our faces with perfect clarity. "Someone used your shower," he said, frowning. "Recently, by the look of it." but there's no message on the mirror. There was, I insisted. It said, "I know you see me," written with a finger through the steam. He gave me a look that mingled concern with skepticism. The steam's cleared now. If there was a message, it's gone. "I know what I saw," I said, my voice rising with frustration and residual fear. "Someone has been in my flat, using my shower, writing messages to me. Why won't anyone believe me?" Grayson's expression softened. "I believe someone used your shower," he said carefully. "That's evident from the wet tiles and the open tap. As for the message, perhaps the steam was playing tricks with the light. Or perhaps there was something already on the mirror that became visible when it fogged up an old fingerprint or some cleaning residue. It was a rational explanation. Too rational. Too neat. But I was cold and frightened and desperate for any interpretation that didn't involve someone hiding in my flat, watching me, leaving messages that vanished before they could be verified by others. Maybe, I conceded, though I didn't believe it for a moment. "Thank you for checking. I'm sorry for disturbing you." "It's no trouble," he said. "Look, why don't you come down to my flat for a cup of tea? Give yourself a chance to calm down. We can call the landlord together. Insist he change the locks. Clearly someone has access they shouldn't have." The offer was tempting, both the tea and the company, but some instinct held me back. Perhaps it was the way his gaze lingered on the shower longer than necessary, or the careful neutrality of his tone when discussing the vanished message, or simply the fact that, as my immediate neighbor, he was in the best position to access my flat undetected. "Thanks, but I should change out of these wet clothes," I said. "I appreciate your help, though. I'll definitely call the landlord about locks." He nodded, looking faintly disappointed, and left after extracting a promise that I'd knock on his door if anything else happened. I locked up behind him, adding the chain for good measure, though I was increasingly certain that conventional locks were no barrier to whatever or whoever was entering my flat. I changed into dry clothes, made a strong cup of tea, and sat at my dining table, facing the bathroom door. The rain continued its assault on the windows, providing a constant ambient soundtrack to my vigil. I didn't expect to see anything. Whoever, whatever, was intruding into my space seemed to do so only in my absence. But I couldn't face sleep, couldn't bear the thought of closing my eyes with the memory of that message still fresh in my mind. "I know you see me." What did that mean? See who? I hadn't seen anyone. Just the evidence of their presence. A closed door, a moved chair, a used shower. And now a message that no one else had witnessed. Around midnight, fatigue began to overtake vigilance. My eyelids grew heavy, my thoughts drifting into the strange territory between wakefulness and dreams. The sound of rain seemed to intensify, to become all-encompassing, as if the flat itself were underwater. In that half-conscious state, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. Something near the window, the shadow shifting against shadow, defined more by the absence of light than its presence. I turned my head slowly, reluctant to confront whatever waited at the edge of my vision. The balcony door, which I know I had locked, stood slightly ajar, allowing a thin line of cold, rain-scented air to penetrate the flat. And silhouetted against the glass, a figure. Not a person, not exactly. It had the general shape of a human, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at odd angles. It was watching me, though I could discern no eyes in the featureless shadow of its face. Just a sense of attention, of focus, directed at me with palpable intensity. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even draw a breath to scream. I sat frozen at my dining table, tea growing cold before me, as the figure slowly, deliberately raised one impossibly long finger to where its lips would be, in a universal gesture for silence. Then it was gone, not in the dramatic rush of movement that accompanies a startled intruder's flight, but in a gradual fading like mist dissipating in sunlight. One moment it was there, a definite presence against glass. The next, just an ordinary balcony door, slightly open to the rainy night. I sat unmoving for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, until the cold draft from the open door finally broke my paralysis. On trembling legs, I rose and approached the balcony, half expecting the figure to reappear, to reach for me with those two long hands. The balcony was empty. Rain fell steadily, forming small puddles on the concrete floor. Nothing else. No footprints. No evidence that anything had stood there moments before. I closed and locked the door, checking twice that the latch had engaged properly, then retreated to the relative safety of my bedroom. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, knowing that the locks and latches meant nothing, that whatever had visited me could come and go at will, visible only when it chose to be seen? The next morning, I called in sick to work and began researching the building's history. If my flat was haunted, and that seemed the most rational explanation, which says something about my state of mind at that point. There might be records of previous occupants experiencing similar phenomena, perhaps even an explanation for what I'd seen. Blackwood Court, I discovered, had been built in the late 1800s as a private residence for a wealthy merchant named Edward Blackwood. After his death in 1923, the house had passed through several owners before being converted into flats in the 1960s. There were no records of violent deaths or tragedies on the property. No convenient explanation for a haunting. But as I dug deeper, an odd pattern emerged. Tenant turnover in the top floor flat, my flat, was significantly higher than in the other units. Few people stayed longer than 6 months. The letting agent had conveniently omitted this fact when I signed my lease. More disturbingly, I found a local news article from 2014 about a previous tenant, a young woman named Meredith Langley, who had apparently experienced a psychotic episode in the flat. According to the article, neighbors called police after hearing screams in the middle of the night. When officers arrived, they found Langley alone, hysterical, claiming that someone had been living in her flat for weeks, watching her, using her things when she was out, leaving messages only she could see. She was hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation and never returned to property. The similarities to my own experiences sent a chill through me. Was I following the same path as Meredith Langley? Was I, too, having some sort of breakdown that manifested as paranoia about home invasion? But I had seen the figure on the balcony. I had read the message on the mirror. These weren't delusions. They were real experiences. Weren't they? Doubt is insidious. Once it takes root, it spreads, undermining certainty, eroding trust in one's own perceptions. By evening, I was questioning everything. The closed doors, the moved chair, even the used shower. Had I imagined it all? Created a narrative from coincidence and forgetfulness, fueled by stress and isolation? The rain, which had continued all day, intensified as night fell. I sat in my living room, lights on, television playing some mindless reality show I wasn't really watching, trying to decide what to do. If I was experiencing a mental health crisis, I should seek help. If my flat was genuinely being invaded, whether by something natural or supernatural, I should leave. The decision was made for me when the lights went out, not just in my flat, but apparently throughout the building. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, momentary tableaus. I fumbled for my phone, activating the torch function, and made my way cautiously to the front door. Perhaps someone else in the building would know what was happening. The hallway outside my flat was pitch black. I called out, hoping to hear a response from one of my neighbors, but only silence answered. It seemed I was alone in my uncertainty and fear, a feeling that had become all too familiar. I retreated into my flat, closing and locking the door behind me. The rain drummed against the windows with increasing force, occasionally swept sideways by gusts of wind that made the old building creak and groan. I directed my phone's light toward the balcony door, confirming it was still securely locked, then began searching for candles or a flashlight, anything to combat the oppressive darkness. In the kitchen drawer, I found a single candle and some matches. I lit it, the small flame creating a pool of warm light that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the surrounding shadows. I placed it on the dining table and sat down, trying to decide whether to wait out the power outage or brave the storm to seek shelter elsewhere. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound coming from the bathroom. Not the dripping of the shower this time, but something else. Something deliberate and purposeful. Tap, 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 like a finger against glass, or nails against ceramic. The sound a predator makes when it's trying to lure its prey into the open. Tap, tap, tap. I lifted the candle, its feeble light trembling with the unsteadiness of my hand, and approached the bathroom door. It was closed again, though I knew with absolute certainty, that I had left it open after Grayson's inspection the previous evening. Tap, tap, tap. The sound continued, unnervingly regular, neither speeding up nor slowing down as I drew nearer. My free hand reached for the door handle, hesitated, then gripped it firmly. Whatever waited on the other side, I needed to confront it, needed to prove to myself, once and for all, that I wasn't imagining things. I opened the door. The bathroom was dark, the candle's light barely penetrating the gloom, but it was enough to see that the room was empty. No intruder, no source for the tapping sound, which had ceased the moment the door opened. I stepped inside, raising the candle higher to illuminate the corners, the shower curtain, anywhere something might conceal itself. Nothing, just an ordinary bathroom. Silent now except for the rain against the window. The mirror caught my eye, or rather, what was reflected in it. Not my own face, which should have been visible in the candlelight, but a different face entirely. A man's face, gaunt and pale, with eyes that seemed to recede into deep shadows. He was standing behind me, close enough that I should have felt his breath on my neck, yet I felt nothing. I whirled around, nearly extinguishing the candle with a sudden movement. There was no one there. The bathroom was empty save for myself. When I turned back to the mirror, my own reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and terrified. No gaunt man, no shadowy presence. Just me, alone with my fear and confusion. I backed out bathroom, unwilling to turn my back on the mirror, and retreated to the living room. The rain was coming down harder now, a relentless percussion against windows and roof that seemed almost aggressive in its intensity. I considered leaving, power outage or not, storm or not. Anything seemed preferable to remaining in that flat. But as I approached the front door, the tapping sound began again. Tap, tap, tap. Not from the bathroom this time, but from the balcony door. I turned slowly, raising the candle, its light reflecting off the glass. And there, perfectly visible in the dancing flame, was a figure from the previous night. It stood on the balcony, rain streaming down its indistinct form. One long finger extended to tap against the glass. As I watched, frozen in horror and fascination, it traced letters on the rain-streaked surface. Let me in. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings. Don't approach. Don't engage. Don't acknowledge. But I found myself moving toward the balcony door, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The figure watched me approach, its featureless face somehow conveying eagerness, anticipation. I stopped just short of the door, the candle's flame reflecting the glass, doubling the light in this dark standoff between me and whatever waited outside. What do you want? I asked, my voice barely audible over the rain. The figure tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if considering the question. Then it raised its hand and traced new words. To come home. This isn't your home, I said. This is my flat. My home. The figure's shoulders shook in what might have been silent laughter. It traced again. Mine first. A coldness that had nothing to do with the power outage or the storm swept through me. Were you Edward Blackwood? I asked, thinking of the original owner, the merchant who had built this house in the 1800s. The figure shook its head, a jerky, unnatural movement. It wrote again, the letters appearing on the glass as if by magic, the rain parting around its invisible finger. Before him, before the house, before the city. This land is mine. I didn't understand. If it wasn't claiming ownership of the building, what was it claiming? The land itself? The ground beneath Blackwood Court? Beneath all of Hampstead, all of London? As if sensing my confusion, it wrote again. The rain remembers. The rain brings me back. I follow the old waterways, the buried streams. I find my way home. The buried streams. I remembered reading somewhere that London was built over a network of ancient rivers and streams, most of them now culverts or diverted underground. One such stream supposedly ran beneath this very neighborhood, its course altered by centuries of urban development, but still flowing, still following its ancient path to the Thames. You travel through the water? I asked, struggling to comprehend. Through the rain? The figure nodded, an unsettlingly human gesture from something so clearly not human. It wrote, the rain is my road. The water is my door. I have been watching you, waiting for you to see me. Few can. Most are blind to my presence. What do you want from me? I whispered. It pressed its palm flat against the glass, the impression so solid, so real that I half expected the door to shatter under the pressure. But the glass held, the barrier between us remaining intact. It wrote, recognition, acknowledgement, remembrance. I tire of being forgotten. There was a plaintiveness to the words that stirred something unexpected within me. Not fear, but a kind of pity. Whatever this entity was, whatever its connection to this land and the water that flowed beneath it, its primary desire seemed to be simply to be seen, to be known, to be remembered. I see you, I said softly. I acknowledge your presence. I'll remember you. But this is my home now, and I need to feel safe here. Can you stop entering when I'm gone? Stop moving things, using my shower, closing my doors. The figure was still for a long moment, its hand remaining pressed against the glass. Then it slowly withdrew, writing one final message. When the rain falls, I will visit, but I will respect your boundaries. Your sight is gift enough. It raised a hand in what might have been farewell, then seemed to dissolve into rain, its form breaking apart into droplets that merged with the downpour. One moment it was there, a definite presence on my balcony. The next, just empty space and falling water. The lights came back on seconds later, the sudden brightness making me blink and raising the question of whether what I'd seen was real or a product of darkness and fear and an overactive imagination. But the words remained on the glass, visible now not as writing but as areas where the rain flowed differently across the surface, creating patterns that would be meaningless to anyone who hadn't witnessed their formation. I slept that night, deeply and dreamlessly, for the first time in weeks. When I woke, the rain had stopped and sunlight streamed through the windows, transforming my flat into a bright, ordinary space that seemed incapable of housing the previous night's strangeness. But I knew what I had seen, what I had spoken to, and strangely, I was no longer afraid. In the months since that night, I've noticed a pattern. When it rains, properly rains, not just a light drizzle that's common in London, I sometimes glimpse my visitor, never inside my flat anymore, respecting the boundary we established, but on the balcony or in the garden below, or reflected in puddles that form on the pavement outside. It watches me, acknowledges me with a nod or a raised hand, and I return the gesture, a silent communication, a mutual recognition. I researched extensively, trying to understand what it might be. The closest parallel I found is in old British folklore. Stories of genius loci, spirits attached to specific locations, or water elementals that inhabited rivers and streams. Perhaps it's something older still, something that existed before humans put names to the forces of nature, before we built cities over sacred places and redirected ancient waterways beneath concrete and asphalt. Whatever it is, we've reached an accommodation of sorts. It no longer enters my space without permission. I no longer fear its presence. On particularly rainy nights, I sometimes leave the balcony door unlocked, a silent invitation it occasionally accepts. We never speak. It has no voice that I can hear, and I have no need for words. It's enough that we see each other, acknowledge each other's existence in a world that has little room for such ancient, inexplicable presences. I've considered moving, now that my lease is approaching its end. But where would I go that it couldn't follow? The rain falls everywhere. The water flows beneath every street, every building. And there's a comfort, strangely enough, in being seen by something so old, so patient, so outside the rush and clamor of modern human existence. So I stay, and when the rain falls, I watch for my visitor, the spirit of water and forgotten places, the entity that travels the old paths beneath the city. Sometimes, watching the rain trace patterns on my window, I imagine it's writing messages to me, reminders of its presence, assurances that I'm not forgotten, because that's what it wanted in the end. Not to frighten or harm, but simply to be remembered, to be seen, to know that someone acknowledges its ancient claim to the land where I now temporarily reside. The rain is falling as I tell you this story. Can you hear it? That gentle percussion against windows and rooftops? Listen carefully. Watch for patterns in the droplets that might not be random, for reflections that don't quite match what they're supposed to reflect, for movement at the edge of your vision when you're alone on rainy nights. Because you might be living on land that remembers older inhabitants than humans. You might be walking above buried streams that serve as roads for entities we've forgotten how to see. And the rain might be bringing visitors to your windows, your doors, hoping for nothing more than acknowledgement, than recognition, than the simple courtesy of being seen. All you need to do is look, really look, and perhaps say, softly but sincerely, I see you, I remember you, you were here first. You might be surprised at what answers.